Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and it's been a little while, but we're happy to come back and welcome you to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War, which is our special mini-series focused on the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russia. As always, we have Dr. Yuval Weber here with us as our resident Russian subject matter expert. And I believe this is the second episode running where we're very grateful to have another guest on to help share her perspective on another sort of, it's not emerging, but it's an area of the war that's taking on increased focus. So we have Dr. Rita Konaev here on here. Excuse me. We actually had her on a brewcast several weeks or months back. I lost all track of time, but it was sort of very early on in our focus on the war, and she came and talked to us about a number of things, but especially about some of the dynamics of urban warfare that we thought might be emerging. And I think that was when Russian forces were still near Kyiv. So that urban fight didn't happen, which is good, right? But there's still a number of urban conflicts underway. And, I think as most people have been following, especially right now in eastern Ukraine, near the city of Severodonetsk, which has been a real focal point of the Russian offensive in the Donbas region. So she's here with us again. She's from Georgetown University Center for Security Emerging Technology. And we're here to talk about that and have a conversation as well about some other dynamics, especially as we sort of hinted in our last episode. We've talked a lot about different clocks that are at play here. Clocks on the Russian plan, clocks on Ukraine's defense, the clocks of how Western support, Western sanctions, how all those things interact. And Dr. Konaev had some good recent interesting comments, and partly why we asked her on here. So Dr. Konaev, welcome back to our series here. Again, appreciate your time. And Yuval, I'll turn it to you to sort of set the stage for this.
Sure thing. And may I say, Dr. Konaev, welcome. Even though this is your first appearance on this pod, I think you're an official friend of the pod and friend of Krulak Center.
It's an honor.
Yeah, it comes with high pay in terms of praise.
Yes.
So in that regard, the comments that that Ian was referring to is to think about, at the beginning of this conflict, it was very fast and furious. Because in terms of when the war actually began, there's a lot of stuff happening all at once. Russia was trying to invade an entire country of 40 million plus, trying to do it from several different salients or several different points into the country. And it seemed like this was going to be a very fast invasion and defeat of Ukraine. Then obviously that slowed down.
Mm-hmm.
And what we are right now is we're seeing something like a World War I style of attrition in what you called in a recent interview with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which we'll put a link to in our YouTube at least, and certainly in the email when we blast this out, in terms of where you called it, this is a war of sustainment. And in that regard, when thinking about attrition, thinking about sustainment, it's not so much about is one side going to win or not, but really both sides are trying to avoid losing, and they're trying to avoid basically giving up too much land, giving up too much space in order to keep the fight going. So before we go into all these sort of like specifics, can you just sort of assess from your perspective as, person who's been following this conflict very closely, as well as, a person with a PhD in political science, an expert in international relations, how have you observed basically, as Ian put it, like clocks and time speeding up and slowing down from the beginning of the conflict to the present?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me back here. I will know to be more careful in my tweets from now on, knowing that there is an audience and a really serious one, and that there might be invitations involved. But, on a serious note, it really is an honor to be here and to be part of this community and to continue having these conversations. I think what you said, thinking in terms of clocks is really spot on, because in the beginning, we talked a lot about momentum. And to an extent, we talked also about timing. But ever since we phased into this attritional phase, I think we need to think more about the alignment of the two. In the beginning, again, in the beginning stages of the attritional war, there were conversations about who can win a war of attrition. And I also feel like we are having less of those conversations now. And that's why I kind of shifted, at least in my head, the discussion towards sustainment as opposed to victory. So again, this is still very much in the, cooking phase, but the way that I've been thinking about this alignment of timeframes, and again, why I'm reading this, at least currently, as not necessarily working in Ukraine's favor, is along several lines. So we hear a lot that the weapons are not getting there fast enough, which might be correct, but for which purpose? Because I don't think that even if the weapons, the heavy weapons, the military support, even the ammunitions would have all gotten there tomorrow or yesterday, I don't think it would have been sufficient given the nature of this current war to ensure an actual irreversible victory in a way that expels the Russian forces. And I think people disagree with me on that for sure. And of course, the Ukrainians and the Western countries that support them have a vested interest in making a counter argument to that. But at least from my reading right now, the time frames of getting the weapons there fast enough right now are no longer sufficient to ensure a victory. Another layer to that has to do with the question of training and maintenance, because the weapons and the systems and the ammunition that is being deployed, all of these capabilities that are being sent forward are only useful if the Ukrainian military knows how to use them. So you inevitably need a portion of training. And we know that the Ukrainians have been exceptionally adaptive and ahead of schedule and ahead of all estimates on how quickly it takes to get trained on some of those anti-artillery systems, on javelins, on all of these other weapons and capabilities they've been receiving. They've been really good at it. Having said that, it's here is a question of timing and scale. So not only getting the training and get moving fast on it, but scaling it. So even if you got all of those weapons there and you trade them sufficiently quickly, can you do it at scale? It's true that the front has shrunk. We were talking in the beginning about the entire country of Ukraine, and now we're talking about the eastern area, but it's still a massive piece of land with several battle fronts. So to do the training at scale, plus receiving all those weapons together, again, those timeframes are not really aligning towards victory. Another layer I think that's important here is the layer of sanctions. And we've been hearing from the beginning that that the Western sanctions are going to hit the Russian economy, are going to hit the Russian technology sector, the industry, the ability to resupply, the ability to, produce more ammunition, to produce more, to reinforce the equipment losses, make up for the massive losses that Russia has suffered, especially in the beginning of this military invasion of this war. It is true to an extent that we're already seeing the implications of the sanctions affecting all of those sectors that I just mentioned. But how fast, but we also know from research and from previous experience that sanctions take time. So for the sanctions to have an operational impact on the battlefield, again, it will take much longer than what Ukraine needs right now and what Ukraine can sustain, at least in this level of fighting and these type of losses that it's suffering. So it's not really a question of momentum anymore. If you can mass all this Western support to the front lines quickly enough, if you can train quickly enough, it's that combination of momentum and timing and scale and alignment across all of these dimensions that I think we have missed the window of opportunity for the type of, conclusive victory that expels the Russian forces out of there. And right now, we are at a phase where we're more likely to be grinding it out, which is where I talk to, the interview that you mentioned, which is why I am increasingly, and obviously not the only one, focusing on sustainment and what are the critical ways to stay in the fight in order to then eventually be able to leverage some of those tactical and operational achievements to some sort of a negotiated conclusion or pause or ceasefire, some sort of a political settlement, however unsatisfying it may be to all involved.
Sure. So like there's a lot in there. So part of that, when you were talking about, an irreversible victory for the Ukrainians. And so we know that even before February 24th, Ukraine and Russia were able to live not well together, but they had more or less relatively little fighting between them before this particular invasion. Frozen conflict, parts of Donetsk and Luhansk were under Russian control. Crimea was taken by the Russians, but in effect, the amount of conflict was limited. So in that time, when we think about, the territory in a certain sense, and, please don't roll your eyes too much, but, sometimes when political scientists think about what are the causes of war, knowing ahead of time that war is costly, war is going to destroy things, it's going to ruin relations between countries, kill people, etc. One of the famous papers within the discipline by James Fearon, published in 1995, said there's kind of three big explanations. One is that the territory or whatever the thing of value is not divisible for whatever reason. A second explanation is that there's an information problem. The two sides don't know how strong each other is, and so when they start fighting, they should be able to figure out pretty quickly how strong each one is. And then the final one, which is in a way that Fearon and another scholar named Robert Powell said, called the commitment problem. And it's when the two sides fundamentally are unable to commit to one outcome versus others. So we've seen Russia and Ukraine were able to divide up certain aspects of Ukraine and certainly Ukraine's sovereignty. We've seen at this point, we're going on, 4 months? This is actually the 4-month anniversary of the beginning of this conflict, which is mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling, absolutely.
And so part of that is, and I think coming down to this idea of Ukraine's victory, we know that both sides are looking at more existential struggle. For the people of Ukraine, for Putin directly, there's no losing here. We think about how strong each side is. When you're talking about sustainment, all this, getting all the weapons, getting all the training, then doing it at scale, if that were possible, could that make a difference? Do we know how strong Ukraine is relative to Russia? And I ask that in the sense of getting the sense of what the stuff that has come is coming. Do we know whether Ukraine is going to be able to sustain on its end, basically not losing for, let's say, until the end of the year? Because the other side of that question is, and the other side of that issue is, the Russian economy basically has enough imports to last, let's say, another year. After that, they are not going to advance as a modern economy. That's probably the true, already. But that's for the 2023 Putin to worry about, not the 2022 Putin. So do we know how strong or how able Ukraine is to sustain this conflict? What have you basically learned over the course of, the first 4 months of fighting?
Okay, so I'm going to treat those questions kind of separately about whether Ukraine has the ability to support where Ukraine stands and its ability to sustain this conflict. A critical aspect of it is that Ukraine is not alone. And because of that, I increasingly think this is a double-edged sword, because Ukraine has the ability to sustain this conflict with Western, continued, committed flow of Western aid, including the type of military aid that we're seeing now at a high level and logistically well executed and performed, with the assumption that it's also not being tracked or targeted or, you know, compromised by Russia, that they're not losing a lot on the supply lines. So if there is a continued Western commitment, I think Ukraine can sustain until the end of the year. Having said that, I feel like we are underestimating how volatile that variable is. There's been massive mobilization. There's obviously been incredible support from NATO countries. There's been potentially, you know, life-altering foreign policy decisions and parameters in countries like Germany in a way that we have not predicted before, even thought about. We have seen a real united Western front. But how long can we really count on it sustaining itself? There's a lot going on right now domestically in the United States. Just today, there is going to be a lot going on domestically in Europe if the gas prices and inflation continue to rise. We have kind of put our attention away from rising populism, but we shouldn't think that it's simply over. We have also really not been thinking about the implications of this massive refugee crisis on Europe, because it hasn't had some of the dimensions and issues and challenges that previous refugee crises from Syria and Afghanistan, with all of their, you know, complications that are related to ethnicity and race and religion. But we're talking about millions and millions of people. And Russia is known for using and weaponizing refugee flows to undermine the political cohesion of the countries that receive these refugees. It hasn't been successful in doing so now, but as the economy gets tighter, if there are political players across the European countries on different domestic fronts that can use these issues to come to the fore, I think that I don't know if we're overestimating or potentially over-relying on the continuation of this level of aid towards Ukrainian sustainment in the fight. If it goes through, I think Ukraine can continue fighting. But again, it would be it would be at a massive cost and sacrifice for the Ukrainian nation. Because we're talking about more months of destruction. We're talking about even greater investments that will be needed in recovery and rebuilding. We're talking about more refugees, more internal displacement, more casualties. And the problem with sustainment, again, is that it gets harder and harder the longer you fight.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, there are indicators that Ukraine can hold, but the costs are rising constantly, every single day. In terms of what I've learned or what we've learned from this war, I mean, a lot of things that have challenged my assumptions and the way that, you know, I approach studying the Russian military capabilities, the way that I approach studying innovation and technological developments. And I mean, just to continue on my previous point, one thing that I think we all learned was not to underestimate the Ukrainians. I think that's definitely, if you're thinking about war as an information failure, an argument can be made. Putin definitely started a war from an information failure, not understanding the Ukraine capabilities. Because I think if they had good intelligence and clear vision of the scale of Ukrainian resistance, and Western support, they would have calculated differently.
For sure.
For sure. But in terms of, I think we're also learning what we got wrong and what we kind of got right in understanding or predicting the developments in this war. But I think one critical thing to me, especially coming from studying, advanced and new technologies, is a key differentiation that we have not been really careful about between innovation and adoption. So in the process of tracking what countries are doing, and the same goes to how we talk about the United States, how we talk about China. In the process of trying to understand what militaries and countries are doing in technologies like artificial intelligence or autonomy, we oftentimes conflate technologies that are in the conceptualization stage very early on to technologies that are in the research development phase, to experimentation, to adoption, to scaling. And we oftentimes write based on our reading of concepts or even research and development, as if these are already operationally viable capabilities, which for the absolute majority of the cases, they are not. There is very limited employment of artificial intelligence, for instance, even by the US military. And it's still very narrow, very task specific, and predominantly in the information analysis domain. And whenever I say I very much include myself in that equation of like how we write, how we think, what sort of sources we rely on. We often inevitably in open source analysis have to rely on statements that are made by the government, that are made by the military, and equally, questionable by the technology developers themselves, who have a vested interest in advertising and marketing their products. So in the process of trying to understand what role new and advanced technologies are going to be playing in the future of war and modern warfare, we got to be super careful in understanding where we are currently in the development cycle and which of these capabilities are ready to go and can be relied upon in modern warfare. And what I think we learned from Russia, with the massive caveat that Russia was never at the front lines of, autonomy or artificial intelligence, but we have learned that in large scale, extremely complex offensive operations, you're going to have very limited time, that especially when you have limited operational freedom, you're going to have very limited time to experiment with new technologies. You're going to have to rely on what is tried and true, which in the Russian case is firepower. And the limits of those technologies, I think, are incredibly clear right now.
So in that, things that are tried and true, and one of the things that you mentioned, in our last episode, we had Rosella Capella-Zelinsky from Boston University, and we discussed, in essence, weaponizing refugee flows. And when Russia started bombing Syria in 2015, that created a refugee flow and a migration crisis into Europe that certainly helped AfD, the far-right party in Germany, get into parliament and probably helped Brexit over the line. And so when we were discussing this, I guess last week or 2 weeks ago, Dr. Capella was in effect drawing out what are the implications, second, third order implications of blockading the export of grain from Ukraine, like from the Black Sea, which is this will cause food insecurity in Africa, which will cause civil instability and governance crises there, which will cause migration crises into Europe, which will create a weakening of European public support for continuing this conflict in Ukraine. which is in effect what you were suggesting about the United States as well. And the 2 hours ago, those readers, those viewers and listeners who will listen to this or watch this whenever, we're recording this Friday, June 24th in the afternoon, and the Roe v. Wade news was just like a couple hours ago. So that's part of like the domestic polarization that's happening in the US, which is just shifting attention away from foreign affairs. So there is, in essence, a migration crisis that's coming into Europe, which will be the direct result of a food crisis that's going into the Middle East and North Africa, which is part of the blockade that's right now. So we know that's going to essentially help shape European politics over the second half of this year and into 2023. We also know that going into an election in the United States, when polarization is seemingly setting new records every day, there's going to be this sort of lack of just attention and sort of concern for Ukraine. In principle, it's always there. In practice, inflation, social issues, etc., are just going to be much more visceral. So there's a lot of costs, and there may not be that enthusiasm. But I think what you were saying in terms of defining Ukraine's ability to fight is not because of the size of the fight in Ukraine, but because of the amount of stuff they do or do not have.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, when we then think about how are these two sides going to fight, and this goes to the technology issue that you raised a moment ago, Ukraine basically has a patchwork of different capabilities that they're trying to make work on the fly. That's on one side. On the Russian side, the big ideas didn't work, so they're going with destroy everything within a plot of land, then send in the infantry. So we have basically stuff that would have been familiar to like World War II commanders, like in terms of the basic ideas there. And with the existing materials that they have, all the innovation is going to come through tactic. It's going to come through like new materials, new capabilities, because those simply aren't going to be made. And so that's, you know, when you were then talking about your expertise in autonomous weapons, AI, stuff that is very cool in theory, but hasn't been in practice. For viewers, in addition to being an expert in the Russian military generally, you also have written quite a lot on two of basically the edges of technology and warfare, which is urban warfare, which is the people shooting at each other from close range, and AI and autonomous weapons, which is the science fiction stuff. And one time I asked you a question about AI and like how does it actually work in practice, and you said something to the effect of, and this is not like a direct quote, but you said something like the Jetsons stuff like simply doesn't exist in reality, but can you get machines to make really simple decisions a fraction of a second quicker? Like that's possible. And so in terms of your assessment of basically what the Russians, what the Ukrainians, but particularly the Russians, I'll ask you a question in a moment. What do you think Russian force design, force structure looks like in 2030 and, you know, and beyond? But in effect, what have you learned about the Russian use of technology in this war, given that we've gone through, in a seemingly short amount of time, several different wars?
That's a good question. I think what we learned about Russian use of technology is that, and not just from this war, but a lot of the conversation about Russian advanced technologies and Russian concepts and how they perceive employing capability like autonomy and AI come from the lessons that they've drawn from the Syrian conflict, which is what they saw as their laboratory essentially, and a place where they could experiment with new weapons and how they thought about new weapons, you know, they can potentially integrate them into new concepts of operation. But again, in Syria, they had a lot of room for maneuver. They had the ability to define their scale of involvement, and they had very limited ground warfare, role. They relied on their air capabilities and advising capabilities on the ground. So there was limited danger to Russian personnel, and there is room for, operational experimentation, because there was essentially room to destroy things that they were already, in the process. So I think that we over-index, and again, we very much includes me, over-index on how much they can do based on a conflict where they had almost everything working in their favor, which is essentially the opposite of the operational theater that they've experienced, that they've opened in Ukraine. And what has been interesting to me with like the dual hats that I wear with, with the work that I've done on urban warfare versus the work that I've done on new and advanced and sophisticated technologies, is that many of the things that I learned and knew about urban warfare were very much proven to be consistent and correct. Defense has the advantage. It's incredibly hard to take a city, place a siege on a city, encircle a city, try to cut off any sort of supplies and reinforcements into a city. It's effectively impossible to do several cities at once. Mm-hmm. And that, in perhaps most importantly, is that it comes with massive cost. It came with massive cost just trying to approach cities in Ukraine, and they got boggled down in the peri-urban areas. So in Kiev, for instance, and even in Kharkiv, we haven't seen a lot of the very much on the ground type of urban warfare, because they got stopped in the peri-urban areas, in the suburban areas, which are, a mini kind of urban environment. So that just shows you how hard it is to even approach it. And the second layer is the massive cost to the humanitarian cause, the destruction. And this is why, as a side note, we're talking about the military aid now and the equipment and the weapons and ammunitions being sent to Ukraine. For every argument that we make in favor of that, we have to prepare to commit and continue committing money and support and expertise at a massive scale for rebuilding Ukraine, because the destruction in cities there is monumental. So it's funny because, again, what I've known and learned and what history has shown about the fundamentals of urban warfare was proven again to be true. And ironically, things that Russia should know, because it has learned those lessons the hard way in Chechnya not that long ago.
And I think part of that is when you think about militaries should be learning organizations, mm-hmm. it certainly seems that the lessons learned from Syria were fundamentally incorrect, because that was a war in which the other side effectively was not shooting back very much. And then you'd have this war, the other side is definitely shooting back.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we can have a conversation about whether the Russian military is a learning organization and and whether it is something that is possible to be under the current Russian leadership or in an authoritarian country in general. But we got to be careful, because even the US military, which I truly believe is a learning organization, is also not the best in learning lessons that it has learned the hard way. I mean, we are right now all in on the strategic competition and large scale, conventional conflict and maritime power and big investments and new technologies. And because of the hard and terrible wars that we fought during the global war on terror, we are kind of reluctant to even talk about counterinsurgency and conflicts at the level below war, and what role will US personnel and troops might play in those types of conflicts in the future. And that's a mistake, because in the early 2000s, we had to rely on very outdated conceptions of counterinsurgency and revive that practice and that study and how to do it right. And right now, instead of trying to keep those lessons alive, including the lessons learned from urban warfare, from Fallujah, from the Anbar provinces, from Baghdad, from Sadr City, we're just kind of saying we're just not going to do this again because we were never good at it, and it's terribly hard, and that's just not how we fight. I think that's dangerous, and it's proven dangerous before, and it will never really prove dangerous again, because there's really no way out of the urban environment, and there's even fewer ways out of dealing with the population one way or another.
So that seems to me a general comment on how great powers fight, how great powers fight conflicts in general, which is they prepare for the war that they want, not the range of wars that are available.
Yeah.
So in effect, what Russia clearly wanted was something like, it's clear from like Putin's own descriptions, as well as everyone around him, all the stuff that's, been leaked and been written, is that he fully anticipated that, in a sense, projected Russia onto Ukraine, which is, if Zelensky's a bad guy, who's going to fight for a bad guy in his regime? Everyone's going to basically fall over themselves to surrender once the token resistance is overcome.
Yeah.
And so therefore, this fighting takes 3 days, surrenders take 2 weeks, and then, half of Ukraine is, now part of Russia. And so in that regard, what it seems what you're saying is Russia didn't prepare for this war, this actual people will fight for their homeland, because that would have essentially changed the calculation on costs. So
I mean, you would hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so and then basically and then drawing the analogy to the United States, the Iraq Afghanistan experience was not a pleasant or positive one. Therefore, why prepare for those bad things in the future?
Yeah.
You should just avoid making mistakes in the future.
Exactly.
So in that regard, what do you think Russia's taken from this conflict? How does that shape whatever happens here? And we're in total crystal ball territory. But in terms of your earlier comments on, designing weapons, designing forces, designing the technology now in order to try to put it into production and then produce at scale later, what do you think these couple of months, what are the data points that you think are salient to Russia on how they do force design and, weapons investment into the next decade and beyond?
Yeah, I think another thing that we've learned in this war is that there is a massive difference between Russian doctrine and how Russia actually fights.
Yeah.
So that is why I think, again, many of us who've been watching Russia very carefully and had assumptions about the way that it's going to approach a large-scale military operation, expecting something very different, because we were, to a large extent, relying on the way that Russia said that it was going to execute such an operation. And then we watched it do something not just different, but opposite. And getting bogged down in situations where it explicitly doctrinally said that it knows not to get bogged down in. So, I mean, things we got wrong, things that we've learned is that not only you're prepared to fight the war you want to fight, but you're also right, a doctrine, an aspirational doctrine. And trying to evaluate how things are going to pan out and how force structure is going to look, or how force design is going, or where they're going to invest, is very different from what is actually being done on the ground, especially since we are now really also seeing the extent that corruption has just decimated any sort of modernization capabilities they've been so adamantly reporting over the last decade. So it's going to be also, from their perspective, very difficult to admit mistakes because, and this is not a point that I came up with, this came up in conversation a couple of days ago with colleagues who also studied the Russian space, is that in 2000, after Georgia, essentially, when they did engage in a moment of reflection and assessment of what we got wrong and why we fought so terribly and why we didn't do as well as we expected, there was a moment of self-reflection that could admit that we had poor old Soviet equipment. Our personnel was not well trained and not prepared for this type of fighting. And therefore, we must embark on a range of reforms and modernization priorities and buy new equipment and restore the old ones and make it more appropriate for modern warfare and whatnot. And they invested massive, massive amounts of money and years into this. So now they can't say that they have old equipment and untrained personnel because they spent a decade and a half on new equipment and training personnel. So admitting that they've spent billions on nothing, not nothing, but on things that didn't work as expected, and that their personnel proved less than prepared for fighting, and their leadership proved absolutely, inadequate for this type of war, is a harder lift than what they could have done after Georgia. So if you're asking me about the future of Russian force design, is I think two things. Like, one is that the way that it's going to look on paper and reported is going to be very different from the reality of it. And second, I don't think it's going to fundamentally change, because they right now are a very constrained position in a way that politically prohibits lessons learned. So I think but this is not to say that they're not going to reinvest, rearm, resupply themselves and rebuild. But that's a very different discussion from whether they're going to learn and change.
So in that regard, Rita, like the 2008 modernization that came from after the Georgia War, under was then Defense Minister Serdyukov, remember his name. That came, like, Russia still won that war in under a week. So there's a level of introspection that one can get after victory that came in 5 days instead of 2 days. We're talking about a war that is about to enter month number 5, where victory is not at hand, which I think is the political constraint, because who's going to get blamed and what's going to get blamed? Which I think, if you take the logic that you were just saying, the constraints on acknowledging the true lessons learned, this suggests that the Russia after this war is going to be studiously, aggressively unchanged compared to what happened beforehand. So if that's the case, what do we think? And this is now just like open question, like, what do you think is Russia's offensive capabilities after this war? If defense has the advantage, Russia is going to be loath to admit that it did things badly. How aggressive, how expansionist, what are the level of capabilities that you believe Russia will have to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy once this conflict is over?
I mean, it's running out of options for monsters to destroy, right? If we're seeing the surge to join NATO. I might be proven wrong, but I still don't think that they will start a war with NATO.
We've seen that both sides have been able to deter each other. There's a lot of NATO stuff that is only there to kill Russian citizens and military personnel, and also, like, that have been attacked. Also, NATO has not directly attacked Russian soldiers. The deterrence at that level is working.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there is actually quite good escalation control, and we've seen Russia and Turkey manage that in Syria before this war. So I think there's interest in escalation control. So I don't predict them trying to start this type of a fight or any type of real fight with a NATO country. So it leaves a set of limited not opportunities, but eventualities that they might explore in reigniting some of their other frozen conflicts. The question is whether any of those sites are attractive to them or sufficient to them to meet the high goals of revamping the Russian power and Russian empire. The thing is, though, they don't really even need to engage in retrospection and self-evaluation and becoming self-critical, because they have successfully, Putin and his layer of media hands, I suppose, I think have successfully redefined this war as not one that is being fought against Ukraine, but one that is being fought against NATO. So if they struggle, and even if they are curtailed in their accomplishments and their territorial gains or whatnot, and even if they suffer massive casualties and massive equipment lost, they're fighting the Europe and United States. They're not just they don't admit to fighting Ukraine. They don't admit to starting a war with Ukraine. They are discussing it as a war against the West. And to them, they are massively disadvantaged. They see themselves as the David in this David and Goliath story.
Sure, the ready-made excuse. We would have defeated all the Nazis. We would have defeated Ukraine, if not for basically NATO taking their side.
Yeah.
So again, begs the question.
We did amazingly well, and we, defended the Russian territorial integrity.
Yeah.
I think we're really underestimating the ability to redefine the narrative within Russia. And I'm not saying that regular Russian citizens are buying this or not buying this, and whether they're easily fooled or whatnot. That's a moot point. It's sufficient. It's good enough.
So I think we could probably go on for like a long time on force design, and don't worry, you will be invited back to expound further at length. But I think this is maybe sort of like the point to consider, is that in a certain material sense, we've seen the limits of Russia's conventional capabilities. That seems to be, they still haven't defeated Ukraine.
I feel like that's undeniable, right?
But we also have a very important political point, which is recognizing that as such is political suicide, because it means all the sanctions, isolation, privation, etc. are all for naught. So this suggests that the Russia that we'll see after this conflict, in fact, will double down on the status quo.
I think so. And, and I try to kind of like undermine my own assumptions and like question them. And we all like have a status quo bias where we assume that things are just going to keep going the way that they're going. So who knows? But to me, I feel like there are arrows pointing more towards doubling down. And again, they can recover the military investments that they've lost. And I think they will be spending more on defense than they have been doing so far. But I think we need to differentiate that from learning and changing and redesigning the force structure to fit a future war, a future large-scale war that they clearly shown themselves not being able to execute effectively. I think they double down on things that they did well and keep doing well and have always done well, which is massive firepower and huge destruction capabilities. They're artillery heavy army, and they're going to keep doing that. What they're going to do with tanks, I think there's a history there and production capabilities that they can't simply ignore. So whether the tanks have been proven to be, let's quite say, with some limitations, is besides the point. I think there's factors there that are going to perpetuate investments in that. Maybe there's room to improve some of the coordination with the Air Force. And you would think, and we thought, that there was serious air defense capabilities and integrated air defenses. So maybe on that point, there is a conversation to be had about alignment between what's been reported as have been modernized and augmented and getting it there. But I don't think that they're going to suddenly start an NCO corps. I don't think they're going to do massive changes to how they're training their troops. I don't think they're going to significantly refocus away from armor. I don't think politically they're going to have a moment to say maybe we shouldn't have, did all those bad things to get us kicked out of Europe.
And I think one can, so basically that suggests, and obviously like this is a point that I agree with, that whenever this particular conflict, so in one sense, this particular conflict has been going on since 2014.
Yeah.
What we are right now is just in a second, third phase of it, whether you talk about Crimea as a phase, then basically the fighting thereafter is a phase. Let's say this is the third phase. The fourth phase, what I think you're suggesting is, once this particular phase is done, when you're talking about doubling down, it's not out of a status quo, out of laziness. It's a status quo of, we are going to win this war and we're going to take a second bite at the apple. And so that the years that follow the conclusion of this phase of the fighting is Russia getting better at fighting the 2022 war. And so this will look more like the time in between World War I and World War II for Germans.
Yeah.
That moment was the economics went bad, the society went bad. But once basically the next leadership came in, they could have either said, we're going to admit what went wrong beforehand, or we're going to double down and win that war against the French come hell or high water.
I mean, that's a bleak reading of it, but I think that's the correct one. And that's where just the political and military realities and also what Western posture point them to. And I think we all know that Russia doesn't finish its conflict, it freezes them. I can't think about a single war or a conflict or a peacekeeping operation that Russia has been involved in where there's been an actual conclusive resolution. Neither in, the separatist parts of Georgia, not in Nagorno-Karabakh, not in Moldova, and not in Ukraine. So
I think the endlessness of Russia's conflicts is the cheery note that we will take into the weekend. Thank you, Dr. Rita Konaev of Georgetown. And Ian, please take it away.
Yeah, I really... God, it's just terrible. We often seem to end on kind of bleak notes in this, but on the flip side, there's really no happier way to spin what's going on there. And I think to the point of expectations and assumptions getting blown up is like there's a grim reality that especially to both of your points about continued support, there are a lot of external factors that could influence that, and so the grim reality is there's still lots of variables at play, and that for all the the plucky heroism of the Ukrainians, right? Like there's a real world underneath there somewhere, and I think we're really starting to, maybe not everybody, but I think those of us here are grappling with the fact that there may not be a good happy ending, at least in the near future, or even in the intermediate future, because there are just so many things at play that we can't account for. And I think one thing we didn't, I'm not going to open this up, get into it, but maybe we can save this for a future one, is but one of the things we talked about yesterday with Yuval and our team at lunch was looking at the human elements here is what happens when Russia starts running out of people, right? And it's not just experienced soldiers on the battlefield. When do they start digging into their deeper population base to keep throwing them into the meat grinder, what does that do to their economy, to their industrial base, to their agricultural base? Like, do they start sort of eating their own seed corn when it comes to pulling peoples out of the field to put them on the battlefield? And same thing for Ukraine, right? Like they have there are human limits here that I don't think we've really quite explored that much. So again, not trying to open that up. Maybe we can save that for the future, because we will have future episodes, unfortunately. Okay. Well, I think we're at a good stopping point. Dr. Rita Konaev, again, thank you much for your continued support to the Krulak Center. One of these days we do have to get you down here, or maybe we can arrange a visit up in your neck of the woods, because it's not far, and say thank you in person. But we'll make sure that day comes. And again, thanks for your support. And as we have more questions about this, maybe we'll get you back again for round 3. All right. And to our audience, not exactly sure when I'll get around to posting this, but if I'm efficient this weekend, you can look to on early next week, where you all and myself are sitting down with Dr. Amin Tarzi, our director of Middle East Studies, who happens to be pretty close to the area. He's in Turkey now. He will be going to Greece shortly, but he's going to do some live on location discussions with us here in the next couple of days, focusing on Turkey, which sort of touched on here, but it crosses into both streams, and both, the West with its NATO relationship and its own unique relationships with Russia. So we'll be looking at that. And then coming next week, next Tuesday at 12, we'll be welcoming Dr. Dara Cohen of John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She's kindly come in through the assistance of our Middle East Studies office to talk about sexual violence in wartime, with a specific focus on Ukraine, but also tragically, it's an element of war just in general. So she'll be there to talk to us about that. Again, graciously donating her time. So Yuval, Rita, I hope you both have a great weekend. Yuval, I'll be seeing you in a couple of days. So, I know where to find you. Don't worry.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.